Hi everyone! Today's palette review is going to be on the Melt Cosmetics Vida palette, which is part of their More Eternal collection. I have previously reviewed the Muerte palette, and I will link to that down below if you're curious about that particular palette, which was also part of this collection. This video will include swatches of all of the shadows, shade discussion, 5 different looks, and my thoughts on the palette as a whole. Starting right off, let's talk a little bit about the palette and the packaging. The Melt Cosmetics Vida palette comes in cardboard packaging, which feels sturdy and very compact. You are getting 10 shadows in here with a mirror up top, which is fairly slim. I like the compactness of the palette, but I don't feel like mirrors that are this long and rectangular and this skinny are really that helpful, so that's just something to keep in mind. There is a total of 16.29 grams of product in here for the 10 shades, so you're getting roughly 1.63 grams each. And I always appreciate the fact that the shade names are printed on the bottom, because I can't stand when it's on the back of the packaging. This palette is rather expensive. It retails at 76 Canadian or 58 US, which I feel is a little bit up there for palettes. I know we keep inching higher and higher with palette prices, but this is one of the more expensive ones that I own. Okay, I think that covers it on the basics for the palette pricing and packaging. So let's take a look at the colors swatched out on my arm. All right, now that you've seen the swatches, let's talk a little bit more about the shadows in depth in the Vida palette. For the most part, I did actually feel like the formula was fairly consistent with the Muerte palette, which I have previously reviewed, but I'm gonna have to reiterate it for the sake of this palette review. Which is to say that I felt like the mattes are the strongest part of this palette, and you are getting 8 mattes, which is incredible, and only really 2 shimmers, which is not typical for palettes I feel nowadays. I definitely prefer matte shadows, but I feel like generally shimmers tend to take over palettes. So I'm pretty pleased with how many mattes are in this palette. The mattes are very pigmented, although they are quite dusty. So when you stick your brush in them, they will kick up a lot of product. You will get like color poofing out. You will get fallout when you're applying it to your eye. Now, the shimmers, I would say are the weakest point of this palette. However, there's only 2 of them in here and they actually perform a little bit differently. So I said in my Muerte palette review that I felt like the shimmers were stiff. They go on the eyelids pigmented, but they are very hard to almost brush on and drag. You kind of have to manipulate them a little bit. The saturation of the pigment is good and the overall effect is lovely, but they don't apply like a normal shimmer to me. I do feel like you really have to like pack it on and then drag your brush, and you have to go back into the pan quite often. That is especially true of Serape over here. It's a very stiff shimmer shadow. It looks lovely. I'm wearing it today and I wore it quite a few times when I was trying out this palette, but it's stiff. Like, it's just weird to have a stiff shimmer shadow. It seems weird to me. So moving over to, oh, I'm probably gonna butcher these names. I'm so sorry, I don't speak Spanish. Alegria was a little bit softer than Serape over here, but it still had a lot of the inherent properties of what I'm just feeling is Melt Cosmetics shimmer formula, which is to say that it's a little bit stiffer. This one was a little bit softer, but still not as buttery smooth as a lot of shimmers that I have used over different palettes and brands over the years. One of the things I found a little bit strange about this palette, especially when I compare it to the Muerte palette, is the fact that there's so many neutrals in this one. This, like 3 colors over here are all browns, and I don't actually feel like 2 of them are different enough to have included in here. Agua Ardiente and then Chocolate over here. I'm looking in the viewfinder and they do have quite a bit of a different tone there, but I don't feel like on the eyes both were really necessary in this palette. And I mention that because there's no real true like pale shimmery color in this palette. Unlike the Muerte palette, which had a very pale shimmery gold, which I would use on the inner corner of my eye, I don't really feel like this palette has an inner corner highlight or a pale shimmery color to use in that area. So I feel like the repetition of the browns just seems like a little bit much. That being said, I did really like Atoll over here as a perfect like transition color through the crease. It really works on my skin, and maybe for deeper skin tones, these deeper brown colors are that sort of perfect color. I just don't know because I've only really done makeup on my own skin. I did really enjoy the oranges through the reds over here. I'm always drawn towards those kinds of colors, so I was really happy with those. The greens, on the other hand, I actually feel like I struggled a little bit with them. The colors look very, very pretty in the pan, but I don't feel like they necessarily translated that well on the eyes. I think the shimmer did, like that one's pretty true to color, but Papel Picado and then Amor Eterno almost lost some of their strength when I was putting them on the eyes. I wanted this green, Papel Picado in particular, to come across very bright lime green, but I feel like once I applied it, it almost took on a bit of a translucent yellow tinge, which I wasn't really expecting and wasn't totally in love with. Amor Eterno could lean very yellow, but it's almost like when I applied Papel Picado, it buffed out into Amor Eterno in terms of like color appearance. So I found that to be a little bit strange. For me, the strength of this palette is really in these 4 shades over here. I really could have done without these 3 browns, and I think I feel that way because the Muerte palette had no real transition colors. They had no browns. It was so focused on color and intensity and depth that it feels strange to have so many browns in this particular palette. And maybe it's not fair that I'm comparing it to the Muerte palette because they are completely separate palettes, but I was so in love with the Muerte palette that for me, this one actually fell a little bit flat in terms of the colors in here and how they came across on my eyes. So in essence, I really found that I was gravitating more towards the reds and the oranges in this palette, but I didn't really feel that drawn towards like the greens and then the browns, and that's a large chunk of this palette. All right, now that we talked a little bit about the shadows, let's take a look at the 5 different eye looks that I created using this palette. The first look uses Amor Eterno through the crease. That's that more yellow shade. And it's not a shade I would necessarily put in that area, but I wanted to try something different with this palette for sure. I have Papel Picado through the lower crease just to change that yellow to a little bit more green. And they do actually really transition well into each other because, as I had previously said, Papel Picado tends to go a little bit more yellow on the eyes. I then have Serape on the lid, and then I put Chocolate on the outer corner of the eye. And I know you can see a little bit of weird dotting with Chocolate. It almost looks like little speckle marks on my eyelid. And honestly, I wasn't really sure if it was the shadow or my brush. And at the end of the day, after trying this palette for a full week, I am convinced that I had a little bit of dampness on my brush, and that's why Chocolate stuck to little areas of my eyelid, because I did not get this problem repeating again. So that's just a one-off based on the fact that my brush was a little bit damp. For look number 2, I have Soul through the crease. I really love that color. It's such a beautiful, vibrant tangerine orange shade. So lovely. I have Alegria on the lid. I really like that color. It's a fun, spicy shade, and it's just a lot of fun to wear on the lid. I have Mexicana on the outer corner of the eye, and then I used Soul on the inner corner of the eye. This is what I mean when I say there's no real like pale shimmery shades to use on the inner corner of the eye. You're basically stuck with using Soul or Amor Eterno, and sometimes I feel like those are a little bit too colorful to use on the inner corner, but everybody uses eyeshadow palettes differently. For look number 3, it's very similar to look number 2, but I wanted to use just the matte colors in this one. So I have Atoll through the crease, which is that more like perfect medium mid-tone transition color for me. I have Soul on the inner third of the eye, and then I put Pan Dolce on the middle of the lid. That's another great orange color. And then I have Mexicana on the outer corner of the eye. I really like bright matte shadow looks, so I'm quite pleased with how this one came out. For look number 4, I decided to switch it up and go for all greens. I have Atoll through the crease again, just an easy transition color. I have Agua Ardiente on the lower crease because I hadn't used that one yet and I wanted to make sure I got some use out of it. Again, there's so many browns in this palette, all 3 of them, that I feel like there's too many. I then have Amor Eterno on the inner corner of the eye. I have Papel Picado on the lid, which came across very strongly green here, but I really had to pack that on in order to get it to be that strength because on first application, the first layer looked basically yellow. I then have Chocolate on the outer corner of the eye, and here you can see that it's not doing that weird dotting thing that was happening on the first look, so can confirm the shadow is just fine. It was my brush before. For today's look, I wanted to create kind of a watermelon eye look. So I started with Pan Dolce and put that through my crease and really buffed it in there. I then took Mexicana on a stiffer brush and put that on the inner and outer thirds of my eye and then connected it at the top, because after that I was going to be taking Alegria and applying that directly to the center of my lid. I think you can see here that it's a little bit more stiff to apply, and I had to blend it out with some Mexicana after the fact. For the lower lash line, I took Serape on a pencil brush and applied that to the entire length of my lower lash line. And then I blended it out with Papel Picado, which here is where I think you can see that it kind of goes a little bit more yellow than it looks in the pan, just from blending it out. For the inner corner of my eye, I applied Amor Eterno and just blended it into the upper and lower lash lines. In terms of this eyeshadow look, I think it's okay, but I have to say that I'm not drawn towards orangey reds with greens. I think it looks a little bit strange on me. The overall effect is okay, but it's not something I'm totally in love with. Okay, so you've seen the 5 different eye looks, you've seen my swatches, and you've heard my thoughts on some of the shadows, so let's wrap up this review. I think in essence, I just don't love it as much as I was expecting to. There's nothing inherently wrong with the shadow quality, but I tried out the Muerte palette first and I was so in love with that palette that using this one now, I feel like it kind of pales in comparison to the Muerte palette. And it's funny too, because I really thought I was going to like these shadows much more because they're more vibrant, they're interesting, they're quite bright, and there's a ton of mattes in here. But I just found in practice, I wasn't in love with the looks. And maybe that's just how I put my looks together, but at the end of the day, I just didn't find myself as enamored with this one as I was expecting. And I think a lot of that came down to the fact that there's 3 brown shades in here that I just didn't feel like were really necessary. I would have preferred some sort of like paler shimmery color so that I could use that on the inner corner of my eye or on the lid, and maybe like a super dark green shadow. I feel like there was some sort of variety missing with some of the tones, because a lot of these are so pale, like the 2 greens here, this orange over here, and then this one's kind of mid-tone, I guess, alongside the browns, that I just sometimes felt like I didn't have enough variety of options for how I like to do my makeup. I would have preferred something a little bit darker and something a little bit paler, more shimmery. So yeah, I'm a little bit sad about this palette actually. Again, there's no real quality issues, it's just not as appealing to me, which is a little bit of a shame, I have to say, because I'm very drawn to these colors. Like, those are gorgeous. I love them. Just looking at this makes me happy, but I didn't really love the eye looks that I came up with. So that's gonna be it for my review on the Melt Cosmetics Vida palette. I hope you found this helpful. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.